through, especially if we have, all of this repetition within the code again. So what if we could consolidate all of this code that we have into just one HTML tag, say the Facebook HTML tag? So this is what, we could consider this some sort of fake HTML tag that we could just use to render the entire website. But where would that Facebook tag be defined? Well, if we kind of break that down, we can see that the tag can kind of be split up into a couple of different sections. So we have, navbar, which might be some navbar at the top. We have the friends area that has the display for all the friends, and as well as the feed that shows all your posts. But these tags are also not really real HTML tags. These are also fake HTML tags. So how would we define these? So let's say for navbar, we can have, for example, a bunch of images representing some icons. We can have some sort of separator HTML tag. We can have a button group, some more shortcuts, things like that. Similar for friends, we could just have a bunch of images. And for the feed, we could have some more fake HTML tags representing the posts. And so what React does, which is this JavaScript library for building user interfaces, is essentially this. It lets us create these fake HTML tags and make things easier to code and reuse code. And these fake HTML tags in React are called components. So that's what we're going to be going into for now. So what is a component really? So a component, again, as I mentioned earlier, of these fake HTML tags, what that really means is it's an abstraction for a bunch of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript all in one file. So for example, a post component can represent a bunch of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript all bundled together in one abstraction. And let's take a look at the Facebook example again to dive more into what a component can mean. So we can think about all of Facebook here as the app component. So this is kind of like the top level component that represents our entire website. So that's kind of the idea of writing our website as one HTML component. Now let's take a look at what goes inside the app component, and we can kind of split that up into the nav bar, the info bar, and the feed as we saw before. What about the feed? We can also split that up into the multiple post components, and these are components that can be called subcomponents of feed. So they're basically contained within that larger component feed. We can break that down even further by saying that each post contains comments as well as a post body representing the actual post. So we can kind of do these little breakdowns over and over again to kind of figure out how our website is structured. And so we can think about this particular structure as a tree. So for example, what I just showed, we can kind of turn into this component tree structure that represents our entire website. So at the top level, which we call we can also call the root component, it's the root of the tree. This is app, which represents everything. And underneath app, we have its children components. So navbar, feed, and info bar. And we can just keep breaking it down further and further as I just showed. So the feed component has a bunch of posts. Each post has the post body and a bunch of comments, and so on and so on. So let's recap components really quickly before we move on. So again, React is a framework that lets you divide up your website into these reusable components, and they represent a type of custom HTML tag that you can define yourself. It's an abstraction of all this HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And then lastly, most importantly in React, these components can be structured into this tree hierarchy that we can use. So given all this, let's take a look at some more key features of components. So what can components have? So first, let's actually dive into an example of a comment. As I showed earlier, a comment can be thought of as a component within our website. And what we want to do is we want to generalize this comment. And the key idea here is reusability. We want to be able to create a component that we can just reuse over and over again. So you might see here on the screen, there's just a bunch of comments. And you might notice that they have like a bunch of things in common. Every single comment has very similar properties. So I'll go ahead and ask all of you guys, how can we generalize a comment? What are some key properties you think that make up a comment? So yeah, does anyone have any ideas of yeah, these properties. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, things like username, time, the like button as well. Yeah, that's great. So we can actually, I guess one thing you didn't mention was the content. That's also a thing that we can add as a generalization. The author name, the username of whoever created this comment, the date posted, which in here represents the time, and also maybe even the profile picture of the user. We can kind of abstract that away and call it a property of this comment. And so what this is here is this is just a visualization of the comment component, and it basically describes how it's going to be rendered on the screen. And we can think about it as well as some sort of skeleton or template for any single comment that will appear in our website. And so how do we know what information to display for each comment? This abstraction is this template is blank, so we need to know what we want to display for each comment. And in React, we do that using what's called props. Props are information, or you can think of them as inputs, and they're passed in from a parent component to a child component. So you can see here, parent passes down props to the child component. And so if you remember our tree visualization from earlier, we have a post component that passes down props to a comment component, which is child component. And it can use these props to render out the actual specific comments. So let's take a look at an example. In this case, the one we were exploring earlier. So we have the parent component, and it passes down all these props. So it passes down the author name, the content, the date posted, and the profile picture. And what React will do is when it receives these props, it will actually render out the correct information here into the actual comment component. So you can see we have the actual texts for each of these properties, and it'll render them out as so here. So one important thing to mention is that props are actually immutable. So we shouldn't actually be modifying these props within the component because we're treating them as inputs, and we don't want those inputs to just arbitrarily change at any moment. Instead, if we want the props to change, we should get the parent to decide, okay, I'm going to change these props. And what React will do is it'll automatically detect that the parent has passed in different props, and it will change the way that the component is rendered. And you'll go more into examples on how this actually works when we start implementing in React. And another important thing about props is that you can't pass props back up to the parent component. So it's a one-way street. Only parent components can pass to child components. Okay, just to recap props. Props allow us to create these reusable components. So it renders out a skeleton with custom content, or again, you can think about it as a template. The two rules here that props are passed only from a parent to child, and that props are immutable. So any questions about props? All right. So the next question that we might have is, how do we actually keep track of the displayed content? And basically, we just talked about props. How do we actually know what props to send down to each of these comment components? So the way that we do that in React is with state. And state is information maintained by a component. And it lets us control basically what is displayed in the application. And it has two key features here is that A, it can be updated. So it's mutable, unlike props. And B, it can be updated by either human inputs. So for example, if you click on a button on the website, or any computer inputs, say like you're fetching something from a database or things like that. State can be updated by those two things. So let's take a look at the post component, the post representing one of our Facebook posts. We're back in this Facebook example. And each post, if we look at the simplified diagram here, has a variety of comments, a list of comments as child components. So how would our app know what to display for each comment? So the way we can represent that is in this little diagram here, we're representing the post component. And we have the props, which for simplicity, we'll say that the post has no props. However, it does contain some sort of state. And this state we can represent as a sort of array of, let's say this is a JavaScript array of a bunch of JavaScript objects. So we have comments 0, which may be something like this, comments 1, which is something like this, and so on and so on. We could just have this large array of common data. And so what we'll do is for each comment that is rendered by post as its child component, we'll pass in one of the objects within our state array into comments as props. So we'll take just one of these, let's say comments I, and it'll render out the comment using those props. So you might be asking, why do we keep the comment data in post and not comment? Why would the comment not keep track of its own state? And this is basically to allow us to control which comments are being displayed under the post. And we'll go through more examples today and tomorrow as to why we need to actually keep the state in parent level components. But this is kind of just a basic idea for now. So we want to be able to control, the entire list of comments that we want to show. So a motivating example of this in particular, let's say we want to mutate this state. Let's say we want to add another comment to the post. Let's say someone comes along and adds another comment to whatever post we have. We can easily just do that by adding another block to the array here. And what React can do is it can automatically just render out a new comment with the new data that we added to the state. And again, because state is mutable, we're allowed to do this. So let's take a look at another example, just to kind of solidify this idea. So let's consider the feature that Facebook has where it allows you to see more comment replies if you click on this button here. By default, the additional comments are usually just hidden. And this concept can be represented as some sort of mutable toggle that is triggered by human input. So I'm going to ask you guys to think about this for a few seconds. So what would be the best way to implement this feature in React? So there's 4 options here. So we can either choose state or props. We can either look at the reply component, which is a child of comment, or we can look at comment, which is the parent of all of those. So and yeah, make sure to look at the hint and yeah. Think about that for a few seconds. All right, so let's see. Raise your hand if you think the best way to implement this is using A, state, show replies in the reply component. Okay, nobody. What about B as a prop? Okay, what about C? Okay, yeah, I think that's mostly everyone. So yeah, essentially we want to put this state as specifically state within the comment component. So what that'll look like is in our comment component, we'll have a new state variable here, show replies, that can be toggled between false and true. And what that'll do is it'll control when it's false, we can just render this, for example. When it's true, we can go ahead and show all of the new comments. So that's kind of the idea of state. So just to recap, state is information maintained by components, lets us control what's displayed. It's mutable, again, unlike props, and it's updated by external inputs. And lastly, it can be passed to reusable child components as props. And so just to recap everything as a whole for components, so components can have props and or state. Props are passed down from the parent components, and again, they're immutable. This is very important. State, on the other hand, is mutable and maintained by the component. And it can be one of their features that it can be kept in the parent components so that again it can be passed into the child components as props. Okay, so any questions so far? Yeah. Yeah, so I guess if you think about the replies as comments, we could say that the show replies would go in post. But I guess because we in the previous example we were considering replies to comments specifically, but if we were thinking about comments as replies, we could put that here. yeah, there's kind of two different ways of thinking about that. But in general, think about if you have a reply, you want to put the state in the parent component of whether or not to show it. Any other questions? Okay. So yeah, I'll pass it on to Kenneth, and we can start coding it.
Cool. Can you guys hear me? Thumbs up, computer. Cool. Yeah, so Enrique gave us a really good overview of React. And now we're gonna have some practice coding up a React component. This is a really quick crash course, so don't worry if you don't get everything. You'll have plenty of practice coding up React as you work on your websites and throughout the next 2 weeks. Cool. So we're gonna practice coding up a component that's supposed to represent a comment. So this is gonna be in comment reply.js, and we're gonna try to emulate something like this. Joyce is saying, wow, peak preschool energy and there's a date, posted, like, and reply. We're gonna, for the sake of time, we're gonna focus on only a few parts of this component. We're gonna try to use a name and a content. Let's see. Yeah, so here's a general overview of a React component. So there are 3 parts that you need to know. The first part, which you can see on line 1, is importing React and some React functions that you might want from the React library. So remember, React is not built into JavaScript. You need to import the library, and the top line of the code is usually the import statement. In the next few lines, you can see that we're defining our component. Remember, a component is just a function. So Abby talked about callback functions, or just the notation of using a function in JavaScript. So in this case, we are defining a function called comment reply and returning something. And finally, the last line in our code is going to be exporting the component if we want to use it in other files in our website. So a little more in depth on the comment reply component. Sorry. So this comment reply component is a function that takes in props as an input, as you can see up here, and it returns what you want to render as an output. So just a bit more clear, this is the function input that you're seeing here. It's just a variable called props. You might want to do some function logic in between, and then finally return what you want to render as the return statement of the function. And in this case, React requires us to return what we want to render in the form of JSX. JSX is a different language. It's very similar to HTML. So for our purposes, you can consider it essentially the same as HTML. Yeah. So let's get some practice. Let's try to render something. We're first going to try to emulate the comment we have up here, Joyce's comment. So let's try to build some JSX. So maybe we want to render a div first, just to get some structure in our JSX. So let's just render a div and assume we have a class called comment-text that we're going to use as our class. One caveat here is note that React or JSX uses class name as a keyword instead of class. This is because class is a keyword in JavaScript, so we don't want to get confused between using the two. So anytime you use CSS classes in JSX, make sure to use class name. And then let's hard code in some additional values. Say we have a header that's Joyce's name, and then we have a paragraph that's just supposed to be the comment content. All right. Do we have any questions on what we just did here? Okay, cool. So we hard coded all these values, but this won't really make our component reusable. Remember, Enrique talked about how one of the main ideas or main motivations of using React is making our code reusable. So our solution is going to be using props. Recall how we passed in props as an input up here. We never used it, so let's use it. So instead of hard coding values in our JSX here, let's use the values from the props that we passed in. So let's load the comment info from the props using props.name and props.content. All right, any questions of what we just did? Okay. So now we can say our component is reusable. And in React terms, this is pure because any input that you put in will, as long as it's the same input, it will output the same thing. So let's just recap and talk about JSX again. Remember, JSX in our return statement in our component is what we want to render from our component. JSX is a stricter version of HTML. And what we return is what the React component should render. Does anyone have any questions on that? Okay. So in this case, the parentheses in the return statement allows to write JSX code inside of JavaScript. And inside this JSX code, we can use these curly braces to return to JavaScript inside the JSX environment and use any variables that we defined in our component, like the props variable. And it can get really confusing to use JSX and HTML interchangeably, but for our purposes, they are essentially the same. And I just wanted to show like a quick side-by-side difference between the two. So as you can see here, HTML and JSX are pretty similar. You can see that a div in HTML is going to be the same as like a div in JSX. But for example, here we have style equals border, etc. But for JSX, we need to enter the JavaScript environment if we want to use a JavaScript object. And then the reason why there's a second curly braces is because we need to make a new JavaScript object within the JavaScript environment. So it can get pretty confusing, but the max you'll see is like 2 curly braces. Any questions on HTML versus JSX? Okay. All right, so let's proceed and let's try to make our component better. So we added props, but that's not really enough to make our component reusable. One thing that we might want to add is adding a state just for practice. And in this case, let's add a state that allows us to toggle between liking a comment and not liking a comment. So here's the React state syntax. You guys have seen the prop syntax, but here's a state syntax. So remember how we imported useState from above in our first line? We're going to use this function that React provides us in order to define a state in our own component. So here's like the general syntax that you'll need to know to define a state in React. useState is going to return 2 values. It's going to return a state that we name ourselves, and it's going to return a state setter, which we also name ourselves. Conventionally, React uses a state and then set that state name in camel case to use to define the state and the state setter, but you can really just use any name you want. So we initialize, in this case, our state to isLiked, and we initialize the state setter to set isLiked, and in the parentheses in the use state here, the reason why we have false is just to initialize the state to false at first. So just an example of what this might look like in code is in your logic, you might have set isLiked parentheses true. And what this will do is it'll set the state isLiked to true. Any questions on state syntax? Cool. So now let's use isLiked to display whether the comment reply is liked or not. We added this line, line 10, which will conditionally render the text based on the isLiked state. So I guess some of you might have seen this syntax before, but a lot of you might not have. So essentially, we're entering JavaScript environment, remember, with the curly braces. And what this is called is a ternary statement. So remember, is liked is a Boolean value. It can be either true or false. And if it's true, then the component will render this liked text, the one right after the question mark. If it's false, then the component will render this text, the like text, which is after the colon. We'll have more on this tomorrow. Don't worry if you don't understand it fully. But just know that this is the syntax for like conditionally rendering things in your components. So now we made our component generalizable, and we can really just use this component for any comment that we want. Cool. Any questions before we move on? So we wrote a component, and now let's try to code Facebook. So can anyone tell me in this Facebook profile, what are some of the components that we might want to extract out? Yep. Yeah, navbar, photos, post, intro, user. Yeah, there's a lot of things we can do. Nice. So actually the first thing that remember that Enrique talked about was the app component. So this is going to be our root, and basically every component in our website is going to stem from this component. And then within the app component, we can have components like navbar, intro, photos, and post. And this is what our component tree might look like. So in this case, app is our root component, and then everything stems from that. We have a navbar, intro, photos, and post. So recall that React components are powerful for their abstraction and their code reusability. So by using components, we can abstract away some code snippets and reuse the same code for multiple purposes. So in this case, some of the reasoning that we might want to use these components is for navbar, intro, and photos, we might want to abstract away some of these codes. And for post, we want to abstract away this code, but also we can reuse the same code for multiple posts, like we saw in the comment reply earlier. So let's jump right into the code. So here is an example of what the app component might look like. Remember the three parts I showed you earlier? There's an import part. Here we're importing the React library and some of the components from the other files. The second part is defining our component. And here, let's just render some of the things that appear on our profile. And then finally, we export the app component so we can use it in other files. So just take a look, take a few seconds to look at the code for this. Cool. So now that we have all this down, we can't really, use this the way we want to unless we pass in some data into the components. So let's practice by passing down some props. So just to recall, props are information passed down from a parent to a child component. And the syntax to pass down props is the bottom line here. Say we're calling a component called post, and we want to pass in two props. One is called name and one is called text. Essentially, we just pass the values in as such, no commas, just spaces. Name equals to whatever we want, text equals to whatever we want. Any questions on prop syntax? Cool. So as you can see here, we've passed down some data as props into intro, photos, and post. So in intro, we're passing down education and city. Photos, we're passing down links, which is an array of photo links. And post, we're passing down name and text. So let's go into the child components and see what we can do now that we pass down the props into the child components. So here's what intro might look like before we do anything with props. We've just hard-coded in, the education section, hard-coded the hometown section. It's really just HTML. And now let's just try to use the props we passed down. So we really need to do only two things. since we already passed down the props from the parent component, we can just have props as an input to the child component and call what we passed down in the JSX. So here we pass down education, so we can just do props.education, and we pass down the city, so we can do props.city. And just recall at the bottom here that this is the syntax we used in the parent component in app to pass down the props to intro. Let's do something similar for photos. We're going to use the props that we passed down into photos. So it's like pretty complicated code. I'll give you a few seconds to look at it. But essentially, we're just taking this array of images or array of links to images, and then we're mapping the links to an actual HTML tag. And then we're just rendering these HTML tags in our JSX. So let's use props. So remember that we can have props as an input to our child component. And because we already passed on the array of links, we can just use props.links and map that value. And everything else stays the same. But look at how much simpler our code is now that we've extracted these data fields into the parent component and just use props. Finally, let's do the same thing for posts. Let's see here that we've sort of hard-coded in the values for the name and like the content and the like button. And now we can extract them into props, have props as an input here, and call the props.name and props.text instead of the hard-coded data. All right, so there's a problem here because we can't really know how to render the like button. Basically, like if the post is liked or not from the parent component, the way the parent component is set up. So we can't really pass down like as a value, as a prop. And the problem that we face is that when the like button is clicked, isLiked needs to be updated. Isliked, let's say, is like, for example, a state that we want to maintain in our post. So I kind of just gave it away, but can anyone tell me what we might want to use to render this? Okay, I'm hearing whispers, but yes, we want to use a state. So here's like the state syntax. Remember that we have to import use state from above, and we can define state with this line. I'll walk through this line. So we're defining a state called isLiked, and we're defining a state setter called setIsLiked, and we're setting the initial value to the state to false. All right, any questions on the top part of this code? All right, and we're doing some additional stuff here from before. We're doing the same conditional rendering here, but in this case, since we have a button that we want to toggle the state with, we can use this callback function on click and call the state setter inside whatever callback function we defined inside on click. So in this case, when we click on the button, we want to set isLiked to whatever it was, whatever the opposite of it was before. So if it was liked, then we want to set it to false. If it wasn't liked, then we want to set it to true. Yeah, don't be afraid if you don't get this completely yet. There's a lot going on here, and we'll have a lot of React practice. Yeah, just talked about this, but yep, we're setting isLiked to the opposite value here using setIsLiked. And then when we're setting the state, it's going to trigger a re-render in our component, and it's going to switch between liked and like. All right, any questions on the states? Cool. So that was a lot. You guys just saw like a lot of the fundamental React code that you'll be seeing again and again as you code your websites. There's a really good guide that we put together at weblab.is/react-guide. And if you go there, you can see some like code examples and a brief overview of React that we put together. So just do that on your free time if you are still confused. All right, so let's just do a quick recap of React. So when we're writing our components, we divide our app into components and put one in each file. Each component is like a function with props as input and returning JSX, which is just HTML-like code. Inside this JSX code, parentheses allow us to enter JavaScript or a JSX environment. And inside the JSX environment, curly braces will allow us to create a mini JavaScript environment. And here's some syntax for props and state. So we pass in props with just the HTML tag or the component tag with whatever prop equals to our value. And in the child component, we can read in those props with just props dot whatever prop name we passed in. For state, we can define state variables with const and like the state name, set state name equals to use state of the initial value. And then finally, React uses class name instead of class for CSS styles. Just a caveat to JSX versus HTML. All right, any questions before we end the lecture? Cool. So React is used in a lot of places. I think the last time this slide was updated, all these places use React. They might have changed, but the bottom line is React is really applicable to industry, and it's still like one of the best frameworks out there for the front end. So we highly encourage you guys to use React in your websites because we have it in this code skeleton as well. You can also use your own front end framework, but we'll be teaching in React from now on in the next 2 weeks. So make sure you know React and get the fundamentals down. All right. So now I think we have Joyce lecturing on UI and Figma.